Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Book Club on The Soul After Death by Father Seraphim Rose. I apologize if I seem a little bit exhausted. I just finished a 3-hour recording with my good friend Lauren Jenkins. So I highly recommend going over to that video and watching it after this. But in the meantime, I am very excited to bring you our show tonight, or not really show, but our book club tonight. We're going to be talking about astral projection and the occult and an orthodox response. So, for a second, I thought you were about to play that clip you were playing before we started. And, okay. Anyway, so last time we talked about occult literature. We talked about that Tibetan bod. He works out all the time, so he's got that Tibetan bod. No, it's the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, all that stuff. So many books. Who knew dead people were such good readers? Guess they've got a lot of time for it. Then we talked about Emanuel Swedenborg, and we talked about his very interesting visions and beliefs and how we related that to various other figures from the last couple of centuries and saw that he was not unique by any means. And one of the things that we saw that I think is important to reiterate is that Emanuel Swedenborg and all of these later occultists, the theosophists, all of these things were actually worse off and more dangerous than some of the earlier occult texts because, for example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is at least rooted in something traditional. It's rooted in Buddhism. And even though there's certainly a lot that we disagree with, and there's certainly a lot of problems with it, it's still arguably better than these things like Emanuel Swedenborg and Madame Blavatsky and all these things where it's not really rooted in anything except whatever this cult leader wants to make up. But we also saw that these demonic visions were accompanied by many signs and wonders that were leading people astray. So all of that helps to set up tonight's discussion, which is going to be about the realm in which these out-of-body experiences are taking place and the what's called astral projection. Excuse me. So astral projection, well, we'll get into it in a minute, but we're going to be talking about astral projection and what it means within the occult circles. And we're going to tie that in with the things that we've been discussing throughout this book club. So let's dive into it with Father Seraphim Rose on astral projection. He says, he didn't say that. That was my contribution. Father Seraphim Rose says, it is well known to Orthodox Christians that man can, in fact, be raised above the limitations of his bodily nature and journey into the invisible realms. The exact nature of this journey will not concern us here. The Apostle Paul himself did not know whether he was in the body or out of the body when he was caught up to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12:2. And there is no need for us to speculate as to how the body can become refined enough to enter into heaven, if indeed his experience was in the body, or what kind of subtle body the soul may be clothed in during an out-of-body experience, if indeed such things can even be known in this life. It is enough for us to know that the soul, in whatever kind of body, can indeed be raised up by God's grace and behold paradise, as well as the aerial realm of spirits under heaven. Often, in Orthodox literature, such experiences are described as being out of the body, as was St. Anthony's experience of the toll houses, while he was standing at prayer, which we saw above. Bishop Ignatius Brianikov mentions 2 ascetics in the 19th century whose souls likewise left their bodies while they were at prayer. Elder Basilisk of Siberia, whose disciple was the famous Zosima, and Schema Elder Ignatius Isaiah, a personal friend of Bishop Ignatius. The most striking out-of-body experience in the Orthodox lives of the saints is probably St. Andrew the Fool for Christ of Constantinople from the 10th century, who his body evidently lay in the snow of the city streets, was raised up in the spirit to behold paradise and the third heaven, a part of which he described to his disciple, who recorded the experience in the lives of the saints. So what we see here is that astral projection is indeed a real thing, and that astral projection sometimes happens to holy people when it happens by the grace of God. So astral projection is therefore not inherently sinful. By the way, I'm using the term astral projection for any time that an out-of-body experience, it happens in a more deliberate way. That can be either because God initiates it for the benefit of a person, or because a person initiates it through occult means, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I'm differentiating that from the out-of-body experiences that we've been discussing in prior book clubs, because those experiences happened to people who were clinically dead or very close to death at that time. So they were not intending to initiate these experiences. But an important context within the lives of the saints is that these experiences are unique because they happen by God's grace alone. These are not people who are seeking out astral projection like we're going to see with the occult examples. So the saints don't do rituals to experience astral projection. They aren't doing sleep studies or learning about how to start with lucid dreams and then open doors, or whatever these things are. None of that is what the saints are doing. The saints are experiencing these things exclusively by the grace and allowance of God. Because God alone knows who's ready for that knowledge, and God alone knows who will benefit from it. So even if you're holy enough to receive such a thing, you might not benefit from it, and God won't give it to you. But if you're in that category, that Venn diagram where you're actually holy enough and can benefit from it, if you fall in the middle of that, then God is willing to give you astral projection if you're willing to receive it, but he usually doesn't, which tells you that it's probably not good for most of us to experience. On the other hand, in Orthodox literature, we read a lot about what's called opening of the senses. Now, we saw before, actually, in a past discussion, that when this happens by the grace of God, it is a very good thing. God wants us to be able to perceive the spiritual realm. We were created with the ability to perceive the spiritual realm, and God has the desire that we would perceive the spiritual realm. So the opening of the senses is not inherently evil. God often does it for us. However, the occult means by which we initiate ourselves into that is evil. And so there are techniques and practices, and through demonic assistance, people can come to an opening of the senses on their own. Some people also are able to accomplish this through ingesting certain substances, and they can sort of mimic astral projection and have experiences within the body that are similar to astral projection. But all of this is strictly forbidden because we are not supposed to seek out these experiences. We're supposed to be satisfied with whether or not God wishes to bestow these experiences on us. And actually, most of the saints who could have had these experiences asked God that they wouldn't, and God granted that request. So God never forces anybody to have an astral projection experience. And if we're afraid of it, or even just simply too humble to accept it or whatever, God does not force us to have these experiences. And I think that that in and of itself is actually quite instructive, because if this was something that we should be seeking out, then why is it that even some of the people in the lives of the saints who God was willing to give astral projection to, they still didn't want to receive it? So I think that that's very important for us to note. So with that said, there's also the earthly side of astral projection. So within these occult texts that discuss astral projection, we have a lot of these sort of speculations about just unhelpful material. There's just tons of speculation about, well, I was in this place and I think that that's purgatory, or I was in this place and I think that that's this, and this seems to represent this. And there's just all sorts of bizarre stuff that's totally unhelpful. And this is why, in general, Father Seraphim actually says it's not even worth reading most of the literature concerning these things, not only because it's manifestly demonic, but also because it's just extremely unhelpful. There's numerology, there's all kinds of bizarre stuff, and it's difficult to make heads or tails of what they're really trying to say. So most people really aren't even able to benefit in an apologetics way from reading these materials. However, there's also scientific texts, and this may sound like something that's unscientific, but actually in the last 100 years or so, something called parapsychology has developed a lot. And basically, parapsychology is the effort by certain people within the scientific and particularly the sort of psychotherapeutic community to study the paranormal. And they come up with their own theories. And this literature is also problematic in a lot of ways. Their theories are rooted in secular philosophies and, and contain a lot of misinformation, we might say. Fake news. But with that said, as much as it contains some fake news, it is a lot more useful for our purposes because it follows a more scientific framework and therefore isn't filled with all of sort of the hocus pocus stuff that a lot of these other things are filled with. So Father Seraphim says, the earthly side of out-of-body experiences is well described. So by earthly side, he's talking about the parapsychology. Well described in a book by the director of the Institute of Psychophysical Research at Oxford, England. In answer to an appeal made in September of 1966 in the British press and on the radio, the Institute received some 400 replies from persons who claimed to have had personal out-of-body experiences. Such a response indicates both that these experiences are by no means rare in our days and that those who have had them are much more willing than in previous years to discuss them without fear of being thought of as crazy. Dr. Moody and other researchers have discovered the same thing with regards to after-death experiences. These 400 persons were given 2 questionnaires to fill out, and the book was the result of a comparison and analysis of the replies to these questionnaires. The experiences described in the book were almost all involuntary ones which were triggered by various physical conditions, stress, fatigue, illness, an accident, anesthetization, sleep, Almost all of them occurred in the proximity of the body, not in any spirit realm, and observations made are very similar to those made by people who have had after-death experiences. One views one's own body from the outside and possesses all of one's senses and faculties, even though in the body one might have been deaf, blind, etc., but is unable to touch or interact with one's environment and floats in the air with an extreme sense of pleasantness and well-being. One's mind is clearer than usual. Some persons even described meeting with deceased relatives or journeying to a landscape which seemed not to be part of ordinary reality. Interestingly enough, this kind of involuntary astral projecting is actually something that my own maternal grandmother used to have happen pretty frequently. She would just fall asleep, and then she would be sort of looking at her body from above, or sometimes she wasn't necessarily falling asleep, but other things were happening. But anyway, the point is that a wide range of people have had these experiences, have discussed this topic, and so from the earthly perspective, even here we see that a lot of these are actually involuntary. They're actually people like my grandmother who don't necessarily go seeking this out, aren't necessarily doing it for occult purposes. However, they're still having these experiences of this realm, and some of those people cultivate this, and it still can be problematic. I don't know if my grandmother ever did that. I don't think she did, but I didn't learn about her astral projecting until after she had passed away, so I never had a chance to ask her about it. Not that I necessarily would have. But there's also Stephen Bancart's talks about the fact that when we say involuntary astral projection, there is still oftentimes some occult involvement. For example, Stephen Bancart's talks about the fact that he had never had any intention to get into the occult necessarily, but he did cultivate what's called lucid dreaming, where you take control of your dreams. And he cultivated this, and basically he from that encountered a demonic presence, and the demonic presence in his dream pulled him out of his body, and from that moment on he had the ability to astral project whenever he wanted, and that led him into the occult. But fortunately for him, that eventually led to him converting to Christianity. But he has a full interview with Dr. Mike Heiser that I recommend watching. I think it's pretty interesting. But the point is that even in these instances where people talk about involuntary astral projecting, there's oftentimes an element where they're perhaps connected or in the periphery of something occult in nature. Again, I don't think that was the case with my grandmother. I don't think it's the case with everybody who does it, but it's certainly a trend and we can't ignore it. So these multitudes of experiences, however, have produced a phenomena that has been able to be studied by scientific research. And so, for example, a PhD, Dr. Crookall is his name, kind of a funny name, but he was actually a geologist and had studied geology for a number of years, had written some foundational texts in the discipline of geology, and then he applied that same diligence and scientific method to his study of these astral projection stories, and he came to some interesting conclusions. He says, first off, a lot of what he says is things that we've already seen in our out-of-body experience discussion, so I'm not going to read all of this, but I will read what Father Seraphim says. Father Seraphim says, this general pattern of events in out-of-body experiences hitherto unrecognized cannot be explained adequately on the hypothesis that all such experiences were dreams and that the doubles described were mere hallucinations. It can, on the other hand, be readily explained on the hypothesis that these were genuine experiences and the doubles seen were objective, though ultra-physical bodies. So, in other words, just as we have already seen with our discussion of out-of-body experiences, it's dishonest to ignore the evidence. It's dishonest to just say, well, these people were just hallucinating or whatever. These people are not having dreams or hallucinations. They are clearly having real experiences. Very often, there will be something to evidence this. For example, being able to recount having seen something that their body was not in a vicinity to have seen. But these are real experiences of a spiritual and often occult nature. So Dr. Krukal, who was applying the scientific method to studying this, came to the conclusion that these people were not having hallucinations, but in fact were experiencing something real. I don't think he would have said that it was demonic, though, because he was secular, so he's purely looking at it from a scientific perspective, but he is saying that it's real. Father Seraphim replied to this saying, this description is virtually identical point by point with Dr. Moody's model of after-death experiences from Life After Life, pages 23 and 24. This identity is so precise that it can only be one and the same experience that is being described. If this is so, it is finally possible to define the experience Dr. Moody and other investigators have been describing, and which has caused so much interest and discussion in the Western world for several years now. It is not precisely an after-death experience, but it is rather an out-of-body experience, which is only the antechamber to other more extensive experiences, whether of death itself or astral traveling, on which we'll discuss that more. Although the out-of-body state might be called the first moment of death, if death actually follows, it is a gross mistake to conclude from it anything whatsoever about the after-death state, unless it be the bare facts of the survival and consciousness of the soul after death, which hardly anyone who actually believes in the soul's immortality denies in any case. Further, because the out-of-body state is not necessarily bound up with death at all, we must be extremely discerning in sifting the evidence supplied by extensive experiences in this realm. In particular, we must ask whether the visions of heaven or hell, which some are undergoing today, have anything to do with the true Christian understanding of heaven and hell, or whether they are only an interpretation of some merely natural or demonic experience in the out-of-body realm. So we have to have caution. Out-of-body experiences and after-death experiences are two different things. But what we've seen is that researchers are ultimately conflating these categories. And Father Seraphim is pointing out that actually the vast majority of Dr. Moody's people who he was interviewing didn't precisely have after-death experiences, but instead had out-of-body experiences of astral projecting, though involuntary, and didn't understand what they were experiencing. So we've now sort of, I guess, finally come to the place where we are not only saying that these out-of-body experiences that we've been discussing, we've seen that they're demonic in nature, we've seen that they're deceptive in nature, but now we're seeing that they aren't even precisely speaking peripheral to death itself, but are in fact simply experiences of out-of-body experiences, a kind of astral projecting. Now, I'm not going to rehash everything that we've already talked about. because we've been pretty extensive in our exploration of these things. But so these are all of these are very similar to the out-of-body experiences we've already seen, but there's an intense light, there's seeing people, dead relatives, and all these sorts of things. But one thing that's different from Dr. Moody and others is that Dr. Crookall actually discerned that there were people who saw visions of paradise and saw visions of hell, Hades, in their out-of-body state. And he saw that there was different reactions between people who left their bodies in a natural way, i.e. involuntarily, versus people who used occult means or forced themselves out of their bodies. But nevertheless, we still need to be cautious because a lot of these stories contain very earthly imagery. So a lot of the same critiques that we've been using to dispel a lot of the other stories that we've talked about can and should be applied here as well for the sake of honesty. But I would say that one thing that is credible about what Dr. Crookall is doing is that there's at least an acknowledgement of hell. His theology of it is way off. His interpretation of these things is way off, and there's a lot of very earthly material going about, but there is still an acknowledgement of hell, and even to a certain extent, an acknowledgement of the toll houses, although he obviously wouldn't call it that because he doesn't have those categories. But, for example, Father Seraphim says, to explain these experiences, Dr. Crookall hypothesizes the existence of a quote-unquote total earth, which comprises on the lowest level the physical realm, which we know in everyday life, surrounded by an interpenetrating non-physical sphere with Hades and Paradise belts at its lower and upper boundaries. This is roughly a description of what in Orthodox language is known as the aerial realm of the fallen spirits, under heaven, or the astral plane of theosophy. Orthodox descriptions of this realm, however, make no geographical distinctions between upper and lower and emphasize more the demonic deceptions which are an integral part of this realm. Dr. Crookall, being a secular researcher, knows nothing of this aspect of the realm, but he does testify from his scientific point of view to an extremely important fact for the understanding of after-death and out-of-body experiences. He says, the heaven and hell seen by persons in these experiences are only parts or appearances of the aerial realm of spirits and have nothing to do with the true heaven and hell of Christian doctrine, which are the eternal dwelling places of human souls and their resurrected bodies, as well as the immaterial spirits. Persons in the out-of-body state are not free to wander into the true heaven and hell, which are opened only to souls by the express will of God. If some Christians at death see almost immediately a heavenly city and pearly gates and angels, it is only an indication that what is seen in the aerial realm depends to some extent on what one's past experiences and expectations are, just as dying Hindus see their Hindu temples and false gods. True Christian experiences of heaven and hell, as we shall see in the next chapter, are of a different dimension altogether. So, the reason why I wanted to read all that, I know that was kind of a lengthy section, but I wanted to read all that because it's interesting to me that Dr. Crookall essentially describes the aerial realm. He essentially describes what we saw in our discussion on the toll houses and the aerial realm. But he doesn't have the categories for it. He's trying to describe this in a strictly scientific way without reference to Christian ideas. And as a result, he comes to these conclusions about there being sort of these layers or whatever The lowest layer being our physical plane, and then these different planes on top of it, somewhat similar to theosophy that we saw last week. But he's coming to that conclusion because he's interacting with the evidence of the aerial realm and the toll houses, and he doesn't know how to interpret it. So now the next thing we're going to discuss is the idea of astral traveling. Now, the difference between astral traveling and astral projection is the length of the experience. Astral traveling is longer than near-death experiences and much longer than simple out-of-body experiences. And in these experiences, the person doesn't remain in the vicinity of their physical body. They actually, well, as the name implies, travel around. And they can even explore, to some extent, the astral realm, which is why occult people seek this out, because they want to explore the astral realm. For the most part, I think they don't understand the dangers of exploring the astral realm. So they want to do this. They want to meet the demons and have a beer with them and all that, or whatever people do in the astral realm. I don't know. So there's occult methods for coming into contact with the astral realm, and even for having more extended journeys there, which is ultimately what astral traveling is all about. So our buddy, Dr. Robert Monroe, is actually, you know what? Actually, I don't think we talked about him last week, did we? I think this is where we're introducing him. So Father Seraphim says, those who deliberately induce the experience of astral projection are often able to enter into this other dimension. Just in recent years, one man's description of his journey in this dimension have received a certain fame, which has allowed him to establish an institute for experiments in the out-of-body. One of the students of this institute has been Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who agrees with Dr. Monroe's conclusions regarding the similarity of out-of-body experiences and the after-death state. Here we shall summarize the findings of his experiments. So Dr. Robert Monroe had a out-of-body experience of some sort, and then what he did was he began studying the occult, began studying astral projection, and started astral traveling, and he apparently became quite good at it because he ended up teaching others how to do this deliberate astral projection. He began an institute, and the reason why I wanted to make sure we read that section is so that we can see, once again, the same names keep coming up, and in this case, it's Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross comes up yet again, having been trained by this Dr. Robert Monroe to perform astral projection and even astral traveling. So we see her coming up again, and we can see once again that some of her influences and what's influencing her work are things that are occult in nature. Father Seraphim says, Robert Monroe is a successful American business executive, president of the board of directors of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and is agnostic in religion. That's going to be very important. His out-of-body experiences began in 1958 before he had any interest in occult literature, when he was conducting his own experiments in a data learning technique during sleep. This involved exercises in concentration and relaxation, similar to some techniques of meditation. After starting these experiments, he had the unusual experience of seeming to be struck by a beam of light, which caused temporary paralysis. After this sensation had been repeated several times, he began floating out of his body and then began to experiment with inducing and developing this experience. In this beginning of his occult journeys, he reveals the same basic characteristics: a passive meditation, an experience of light, a basic attitude of trust and openness to new and strange experiences, all in conjunction with a practical outlook on life and a lack of any profound awareness or experience of Christianity. That opened Swedenborg up to his adventures in the world of spirits. At first, Monroe's journeys were to recognizable places on Earth, nearby places at the beginning, and then places further away, with some successful attempts to bring back actual evidence of the experiences. Then he began to contact ghost-like figures, the first contact being part of a mediumistic experiment. The Indian guide sent by the medium actually came for him. Finally, he began to enter into contact with strange landscapes which he claimed were seemingly not from Earth. So basically, he develops this method, and he took very detailed notes of his experiences. And these detailed notes come to the conclusion that there are these three locales. So locale one is essentially this world. He was able to travel to places that were actually of our physical plane. And as as Father Seraphim says, he was even able sometimes to come back with some evidence of these travels. But then he discovered locale 2, which is a non-material spiritual plane, what we would call the aerial realm. And then he discovered locale 3, which was worldly again, but somehow different. I strongly suspect that this is also simply part of the astral realm, or the aerial realm, excuse me. So he had these extensive travels. His initial fear was overcome, and then he was able to travel in these spiritual realms more extensively, had encounters with beings, various beings of light. And these encounters are actually really disturbing in nature. He encounters these journeys with beings who, by his own description of them, are rather startling in nature. These beings would, he says, if he extended his hand to shake their hand, sometimes they would shake his hand and be very friendly. Sometimes they would reach out with these hooks and snatch his hand and cause him great pain, and would mock him and all kinds of things. So even in his own descriptions of these things, his stories are rather disturbing and should be frightening to us. But Father Seraphim says, having no faith of his own, Monroe opened himself up to the religious suggestions of these beings from this realm. He was given prophetic visions of future events, which sometimes did in fact come to pass even as he saw them. Once, when a white ray of light appeared to him on the boundary of the out-of-body state, he asked it for an answer to his questions about this realm. A voice from the ray answered, "Ask your father to tell you of the great secret." At the next opportunity, Monroe accordingly prayed, "Father, guide me. Father, tell me the great secret." It is obvious from all of this that Monroe, although remaining secular and agnostic in his religious outlook, gave himself over freely to be used by the beings of the occult realm, who of course are demons. So in this instance, we see an act of essentially willful prelist. This is someone who has no real encounter with Christianity and enters into pure and unadulterated prelist. The demons are not pretending to be Christian saints or Christian figures, they are simply able to deceive him with complete and total ease. Now, one of the things that's very important about Dr. Monroe is that, of course, his studies conclude that Christianity is all wrong, and hell and paradise are actually both simply parts of locale 2, and the goal should actually be to move past locale 2 and enter into locale 3. So the goal, according to Dr. Monroe, is actually not to go to heaven. The goal is to avoid both heaven and hell by simply moving on to locale 3, which is conspicuously very similar to Earth, but different somehow, totally more spiritual. It's just very clear that this is, again, willful prelist. The man remains agnostic religiously, but yet is teaching people about the spiritual realm, and his source is not even trust me, bro. His source is literally a demon told me. So on page 108, Father Seraphim continues saying, most revealing, however, is Monroe's experience of heaven. 3 times he traveled to a place of pure peace, floating in warm, soft clouds which were swept by constantly changing colored rays of light. He vibrated in harmony with the music of worldly choirs. There were nameless beings around him in the same state with whom he had no personal contact. He felt this place to be his home, his ultimate home, and was lonely for it some days after the experience ended. This astral heaven, of course, is the ultimate source of the Theosophist teaching on the pleasantness of the other world. Yet how far it is from the true Christian teaching of the kingdom of heaven, far outside of the aerial realm, with its fullness of love and personality, and the conscious presence of God, which has become utterly remote from the unbelievers of our time, who ask nothing more than a nirvana of soft clouds and colored lights. The fallen spirits can easily provide such an experience of heaven, but only Christians struggle in the grace of God can raise us to the true heaven of God. Lord have mercy. Basically, Robert Moody's experiences are pretty weak sauce, and it's easy for demons to give him this experience and say, look, this is pleasant, so you must be in heaven. And then he goes, yeah, that's right. This is pleasant, so it must be heaven. And so he also experiences what is, frankly, perhaps the most manifestly demonic vision that I've ever heard recounted. We have repeatedly visited the verse 2 Corinthians 11:4, which says, and no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. However, in this particular vision, I'm not even sure how much masquerading Satan is doing. It seems to me that anyone with even a remote interest in Christianity would pretty easily know that this is a description of Satan, and yet somehow this Dr. Monroe is totally convinced that this is in fact God that he's experiencing. But basically, to recount the vision, he says that he was in this realm, this spiritual plane, the place, the zone 3 or whatever it's called, and he had this experience where he heard trumpets, and then all of the beings in the realm, without any sort of conscious effort, without any sort of personality of their own, all of the beings in the realm, himself included, laid down on the ground, and this being of light walked over them like they were a road. This is just manifestly demonic, disturbing stuff. I mean, I can't think of a more clear-cut way of showing that something is demonic. First of all, it's impersonal. Um, God God creates us, each one of us, to be unique. God doesn't create us to be these impersonal robots who are just, following along. Just following orders isn't what God created us to be. Um, and also, in addition to being impersonal, this being of light supposedly fills Robert Monroe with acceptance and calm. Not at all like God, who fills you with a sense of awe of his holiness. No, this being just fills you with a sense of acceptance. And obviously, that's apparently acceptance of your place to be a road beneath his feet. Um, it's incredibly disturbing. But interestingly enough, though, Robert Monroe gives us the most thorough discussion of the being of light to date. All of the other discussions of the being of light so far have been largely vague and unclear. This one is actually the clearest vision, and it's also the most disturbing. Father Seraphim says, it would be difficult to find in all the occult literature of the world a more vivid account of the worship of Satan in his own realm by his impersonal slaves. In another place, Monroe describes his own relationship to the prince of the realm into which he had penetrated. One night, some 2 years after the start of his astral travels, he felt himself bathed in the same kind of light that accompanied the beginning of these experiences, and he felt the presence of a very strong, intelligent, personal force which rendered him powerless and with no will of his own. I received, he says, the firm impression that I was inextricably bound by a loyalty to this intelligent force and always had been, and that I had a job to perform here on earth, end quote. In another similar experience with the unseen force or entity several weeks later, it or they seemed to enter in and search his mind, and then, quote, they seemed to soar up into the sky while I called after them, pleading. Then I was sure that their mentality and intelligence were far beyond my understanding. It is an impersonal, cold intelligence with none of the emotions of love or compassion which we respect so much. I sat down and cried deep sobs that I have never cried before, because then I knew without any qualification or future hope of change that the God of my childhood, the God of the churches and of religions throughout the world, was not as we worshipped him to be, that for the rest of my life I would suffer the loss of this illusion, end quote. One could scarcely imagine a better description of the encounter with the devil, which so many of our unsuspecting contemporaries are now undergoing, being helpless to resist it because of their estrangement from Christianity. I mean, you really can't overstate how demonic this experience is. And one thing that I think is very interesting is that he repeatedly notes that this being removes his will, that this being is cold and impersonal and has none of the emotions of love or compassion. I mean, who does that sound like? That clearly sounds like the devil. And as far as removing the will, I found that to be very interesting because it's fascinating to me that Satan promises us freedom, but the reality is that what he delivers is actually enslavement. We are promised that we'll be free if we're free to sin, but then we find that that sin is actually a form of bondage. It's not free at all. And so I think this is very interesting that Robert Monroe had these experiences that very much confirm this sense of false freedom. So why are we examining this guy's work? Well, it's because there actually is some value in understanding these things. Father Seraphim says the value of Monroe's testimony regarding the nature of the beings of the astral plane is great. Although he himself became deeply involved in it and actually gave his soul over in submission to the fallen spirits, he describes his experiences in a straightforward and non-occult language and from a relatively normal human point of view that make his book a persuasive warning against experiments in this realm. Those who know the Orthodox Christian teaching on the aerial world, as well as on the true heaven and hell, which are outside it, can only be the more fully convinced of the reality of the fallen spirits and their realm, as well as the great danger of contacting them, even through a seemingly scientific approach. As Orthodox Christian observers, we not only need not know how much of his experience was real and how much was a result of spectacles and illusions engineered for him by the fallen spirits. Deception is so much a part of the aerial realm that there is no point even trying to unravel its precise forms. But that he did encounter the realm of the fallen spirits simply cannot be doubted. Obviously, it's completely accidental, but he does confirm holy orthodoxy. In fact, he confirms everything we've been exploring so far, but also his experiences are written in a down-to-earth, scientific, objective way that makes them easier to explore. And Father Seraphim himself says that these are things that we're more capable of studying. It doesn't have all of the kind of Fox Mulder stuff. So now we get into the area of drug-induced astral projection, which is, very problematic. But astral travel initiated by certain substances such as LSD, acid, DMT, many, many other things. And the beings that people encounter while they're in that state, there's sort of universal descriptions of these beings. There's actually some YouTube channels where people describe their trips and describe all of the beings that they've encountered and the bizarre experiences they've had. And I don't recommend watching these YouTube channels, but I'm just saying that it's out there. And the few times that that I've examined any of this stuff, I've found a common thread is that these things are very clearly demonic, but there's also this very clear sense that people are having the same experiences with similar entities. Now, we might be tempted to dismiss these experiences. Folks who haven't, done drugs or anything might be tempted to dismiss these experiences simply as hallucinations. After all, we call these things hallucinogenic drugs for a reason. However, people having the same experiences from a wide range of different cultures and backgrounds and all these things. And furthermore, it's actually the people who are most likely to have the most vivid experiences are actually people with the most sanity, people who have the most cognitive awareness. Very similar to what we were saying before about the out-of-body experiences. The people who have the most vivid out-of-body experiences, the people who have the most clear out-of-body experiences are the people who have the most presence of mind. People who are out of their mind actually have a more difficult time having grounded visions, having experiences that are grounded in reality. Ultimately, it's pretty safe to say, and the vast majority of scientific studies confirm this, human beings know the difference between hallucinations and reality. Human beings know the difference between when we are seeing something that isn't there versus when we're seeing something that is there. And by the way, this also applies to children. Even children actually do know the difference between reality and fantasy, which is why we shouldn't dismiss it when children have experiences of the paranormal. And also why, when the thing is that people who have experiences of the paranormal often get dismissed and told that they're hallucinating. And I've been told that, oh, you just hallucinated something and you saw something that wasn't really there, etc. But the reality is that I know the difference between reality and fiction. I know the difference between imagination and something being right in front of me. And most people do. The people who don't have a serious problem, but those are not the people who have convincing experiences. So another example of this is shamanism. And shamanism involves oftentimes the use of potions and elixirs and consumption of substances to make contact with the aerial realm. So it shouldn't surprise us that when we use the same sorts of methods for our own selves, that we sometimes encounter the same sorts of entities and the same sorts of things. Now, shamanism is obviously not a good thing. It's obviously very problematic and demonic. However, I would say that people personally ingesting these things without any sort of tradition associated with it is even worse than shamanism, because at least shamanism has more control. These potions and elixirs are using sort of ancient methods and all of this. I'm not recommending that you go try shamanism. All I'm saying is that I think that there's a vast difference between shamanism and just getting high in your basement. I actually think that the latter is significantly more dangerous, because shamanism, at least you're trying to be kind of in control of what's happening and of your communications with the other entities. Whereas people just having acid trips, they have no control over the experience with the entity. So problematic. Both are problematic. Both are pagan. Don't do either one. But another thing that is interesting is the connection with mystery religions. So in some sense, mystery religions, I suppose, are perhaps just a little bit more advanced form of shamanism. But in another sense, they're really not. I mean, the Egyptian mystery religions and the Babylonian mystery religions were extremely elaborate and complex, and actually had a liturgy, a liturgical cycle of their own. The Baal cycle, for example, is actually a liturgical cycle that is based on the texts describing the life of Baal. So all of these mystery religions used a mixture of substances and sleep deprivation and other things to induce these ecstatic experiences. The most famous of these is probably the Eleusinian Mysteries. We don't really know what the Eleusinian mysteries were or what happened in them, but we do know that they had a profound effect on people. In fact, Plato actually participated in the Eleusinian mysteries and described them as essentially a cure for atheism, because they were such a profound experience. He also said that interacting with Socrates produced much the same results as the Eleusinian mysteries, because Socrates was so incredibly wise that his wisdom was basically on the same level of experiencing the Eleusinian mysteries. I really don't know that much about the Eleusinian mysteries because nobody does. The most thorough description we have of them is from Plato, but Plato intentionally leaves out the vast majority of details because it was a mystery cult and only the initiates were supposed to be allowed to experience the Eleusinian mysteries, which has produced something pretty fun for fans of horror because horror writers can make the Eleusinian mysteries anything we want them to be and make them very frightening. But the reality is we don't know what exactly they were. All we know is that sleep deprivation, long journeys, and probably some kind of substance ingestion were used to help bring about ecstatic experiences. However, well, it's not the Eleusinian mysteries. We do have the testimony of someone who was an adept in occult practices, was a verified sorcerer, and was very much an initiate in, and not just an initiate, but initiator of these mystery cults, who gives us who spills the beans. He gives us a lot of details because he converted to Christianity and renounced these evil things and tells us all about them because we should have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. So Saint Cyprian, the former sorcerer, was super based and gave us all the details we could never want regarding these things. So I'm going to go ahead and read a segment from the life of Saint Cyprian so that we can learn about the occult from someone who used to practice it and became a Christian. On Mount Olympus, Cyprian studied all manner of diabolical arts. He mastered various demonic transformations, learned how to change the nature of the air. In this place, he saw a numberless legion of demons with the prince of darkness at their head. Some stood before him, others served him, still others cried out in praise of their prince, and some were sent into the world in order to corrupt people. Here he likewise saw in their false forms the pagan gods and goddesses and all diverse phantoms and specters, the invocation of which he learned in a strict 40-day fast. Thus he became a sorcerer, a magician, a destroyer of souls, and a great friend and faithful slave of the Prince of Hell, with whom he conversed face to face, being vouchsafed to receive from him great honor, as he himself testified. Believe me, he said, I have seen the Prince of Darkness himself. I greeted him and his ancients. He promised to make me a prince after my departure from the body and for the course of earthly life to help me in everything. The outward appearance of the Prince of Darkness was like a flower. His head was covered by a crown, not an actual one, but a phantom one made of gold and brilliant stones, as a result of which the whole space around him was illuminated and his clothing was astonishing. When he would turn to one or the other side, that whole place would tremble, and a multitude of evil spirits of various degrees stood obediently at his throne. I gave myself over entirely to his service at that time, obeying his every command. Now, he later repented, but I would point out that he was clearly a much more powerful adept of the Antichrist when he was a servant of Satan, because he actually was able to have these experiences without leaving the body. He never did any astral projecting, and yet had more vivid communications than even Dr. Monroe. But fortunately, he later repented, and he gives us all of the secrets. So the conclusions that we can come to with this are, first and foremost, near-death experiences and after-death experiences are actually simply another form of out-of-body experiences, which is kind of an involuntary astral projection. Another thing we can conclude is that within the astral realm, there are many deceptive spirits. And this is, as we saw, the realm of the particular judgment, but it is still part of this world. So people having these otherworldly experiences are actually having this worldly experiences. It's just that they're experiencing the unseen realm. Another thing is the teaching of prelist. Whether invoked by mediums or met in astral travel, these are not spirits of the dead. They are demons, and they are not to be trusted. And by the way, even if they are spirits of the dead, they're spirits of the demonic dead, who are also deceptive. Because remember, some dead people do become demons. We see that in, for example, the Book of Jubilees. So just because you're having an experience and you think it's somebody who's dead, even if you happen to be right, that doesn't mean you're not experiencing a demon. But these things are not to be trusted, because as we saw, Satan transforms himself into an angel of light. They deceive us by giving us images and experiences of peace and pleasantness, but it's a deceptive peace and a deceptive pleasantness. And much of our experience is actually simply just natural. They're able to convince us of things through demonic suggestion and visions. Another conclusion we must come to is that experience is not a faithful guide. Experience can teach us a lot, but experiences can also be misleading. I think all of us have had experiences in our life where we thought one thing, but later, because we had more information, we were able to see that we were incorrect, and that our previous interpretation of what we had seen was wrong. When you introduce demonic deception into the picture, you get simply the fact that experience cannot by itself be a faithful guide. Experience by itself cannot guide us, certainly in matters of salvation, but really in any area of life, we have to be somewhat skeptical of our own experiences. It's only in Holy Orthodoxy that we can have full, accurate information, that we can have the fullness of knowledge, because it's only in Orthodoxy that we receive Jesus' promise that all things will be revealed to you. That is only true within the confines of Holy Orthodoxy. Outside of the church, you don't know what is demonic and what isn't. So that really brings us to the end of our discussion. This morning, I did air the end of this chapter, in which Father Seraphim discusses reincarnation. I showed his refutation of reincarnation. And next week, we're going to be talking about the Christian experience of heaven. So if you're so inclined, and I hope you are, I highly recommend going and watching watching that discussion on reincarnation and seeing what Father Seraphim says about that. And of course, my discussion with Lauren today about the the life of Saint Moses. And today we got to the part where we were discussing the law of Moses and the universal law. So really helpful materials, and I thank you very much for watching. God bless. Please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed.